Hello, pumpkin people! For the final video of 13 projects of Halloween, what better way to celebrate than to share the making of my Halloween costume. This is slightly a costume to just make a bunch of things that I've always wanted to make, but also one that hopefully won't be super hot because at the end of October in Melbourne, it is getting warm. It was also one that my partner was on board for, so we are not making just one creepy pumpkin person, but two. For this, I'm going to focus a little bit more on talking through the construction of my costume since I am not as familiar with sewing historic inspired menswear. I'm going to be following the pattern instructions for my partner's costume pretty closely. Any deviations and I will absolutely flag them and take you through. Now this is a big undertaking, so let's just jump on in. For my costume, I adapted Simplicity's 8162 stays pattern, so the strap is attached to the front and the front is cut on the fold. I also didn't want to have bias binding at the top and strap, so I added seam allowance at the top and bottom to make it so I could sew it and flip it. The dress is made out of some homespun quilting cotton, and I used some heavy cotton twill for the interlining. After sewing the boning channels, I stitched the main and lining together at the top and sides before clipping the curves and corners and turning right side out. The skirt was made up of 3 rectangles stitched together. One the full width of the fabric, 112 centimeters, and the other 2 half of that width. All 3 were roughly long enough to hit my mid-calf. I attached the 2 smaller rectangles to either side of the larger one and hemmed the whole thing using a decorative stitch. I hand-stitched eyelets along the back at 2.5 centimeter intervals. Two rows of gathering stitches were placed along the top, and then the skirt was attached to the bodice just slightly above my natural waist. Matching the hem stitching, I stitched the back of the skirt 3/4 of the way closed. I've got the dress done, and now I am going to start on the 2 tops. I am cutting it fine to my deadline at this point. Not too fine, but we're getting closer to that where I'm like, everything still needs to be finished. So hopefully we get through these and they look okay. Otherwise I will just use something that I have in my closet. But I'm about to start my top, which is going to be a little bit like a partlet, but with poofy sleeves. And then I've also got to do the doublet for James. And then it's just finishing everything together to make it all fancy and proper and good, which will be great. So I will take you down to the fabric. Let's go. I will be using the Liberty Fabrics Thea boho sleeve shirt that looks like that. Pieces 5, 1, 4, and 10. I've got my linen here, so let's just jump on in. I actually ended up using pieces 1, 2, 3, 5, and 10, and adding the general sleeve cap curve onto piece 10. Since it's so gathered, I was very approximate with the partlet pieces. I cut the back and collar on the fold, then stitched together the front and back at the shoulders and side seams. I cut down the center front and used the same decorative stitch to hem the new front opening. I just eyeballed the size of the ruffle, which is roughly 10 centimeters wide and just over double the length of the collar. I pleated it to the top of one of the collar pieces and basted it into place. Then I stitched the other half of the collar on top. I gathered the top of the shirt and pinned in between the 2 collar layers. Stitched it to the inside collar, and used a decorative stitch to sew the outer edge of the collar to both layers. I put another round of decorative stitches on the ruffle edge of the collar. I gathered and attached the sleeves at the armholes. I attached the ties to the collar and then stitched a drawcord hem on the bottom of the partlet. The sleeves were a little long, so I trimmed them back to about 3/4 length and then folded it back twice to create a casing for the elastic to go in the hem. The final step was to thread some cotton string in the partlet hem. For James's costume, I chose Simplicity 4059, making the doublet and pants of costume B. I completely forgot to film most of the sewing of the pants for James. They're made up of the same cotton linen as my partlet. I followed the pattern's instructions, except I didn't attach a yoke tab, but I might go back and do so later. I also opted to do elastic for the bottom of James's pants instead of ties. I cut this small, but James is very skinny, so I probably could have done the extra small. I hand-stitched the inside of the yoke before adding the elastic to the hems. The doublet is made of the same homespun as my dress. I omitted the peplum, and I didn't realize the pattern said interfacing for piece 2, so I used an extra layer of cotton for the interfacing. When attaching the lining, I stitched all of the edges except for the side seams. I clipped the deeper curves at the armhole and then used pinking shears for the tops of the armhole to reduce the bulk. I forgot to film the sewing portion of this, but I pressed the side back seam allowance in and then slid the front side seam allowance into the back side seam before top stitching it into place. James opted for 5 silver buttons for my stash instead of lacing, so I used some stash cording to make button loops and then stitched the buttons into place. These paper mache pumpkin heads were a pain to do. We ended up only doing about 3 to 4 layers of paper mache, which ended up potentially not being enough, and we definitely had holes. Once dry, we tried to paint directly over the newspaper with orange poster paint, but after 3 layers, you could still see through the paint. So we used some wall primer to give it an opaque base, and then did 2 layers of orange over the top before painting the faces. Whew. Well, that was quite the project. The heads were probably the most troublesome part since we had to wait for semi-decent weather so that the paper mache would dry, and then the painting process took so long. Oof. Making the decision to paint white over all 3 layers of the orange that we had already done over a couple days was a painful choice to make, but I think they look a lot better for it. Other than that, they're actually not too bad. They don't have any like painful pointy bits that poke in or anything like that, and are like as comfortable as it is to wear basically a bucket over your head. It definitely smells like paste, but you know, not too bad. Let me start with my costume, which I'm just gonna undo the neck a little bit. Oh, that's a bit more comfortable too. Okay, I ended up making everything for it except for the tights. I did make myself a last minute roll to go under the skirt out of a knee-high sock and then stuffed with several of James's socks inside, and then I just safety pinned it around my waist. I think it works for a 5-minute before filming fix. Is it the best thing ever? No. But it's not bad for just trying to kind of give it a nicer silhouette, and I think a fuller one to kind of match the size of the head. I also added a light petticoat over the top just because obviously this is a little lumpy because it's just socks in socks. So I did add just a very light like tulle petticoat. It's like 2 layers of tulle, so it's super, super light, but it just kind of smoothed it out a little bit. If I were to wear this again, and I do hope to, it's not bad, I think I would make a few more foundational pieces for it. I also definitely missed a few threads in my clean down, so that was probably in the reveal. Oh, I also just laced the back of the dress with more of the cotton string that I did the partlet with, and then made a little draw cord for the back of the skirt to sort of cinch that closed as well, but also make it a bit flexible in terms of sizing. Should I put on or lose a bit of weight? For James's look, this was the first time I've made menswear from like completely from scratch. I never actually added a closure to the back of the pants. We just pinned them on for the reveal. So I'll need to go back and add that. I think his linen shirt worked pretty well underneath the doublet, and it definitely saved me time because I didn't have to sew one. The doublet's not terrible. It's actually pretty good for just like homespun cotton, especially because I didn't put interfacing in it. I probably should have put another layer like I did with the top of this, of like the twill in between, and that would have given it just that little bit more rigidity. I wish it was wool, but I think that would be way too hot to wear at this time of year. Although it's rainy and a little bit chilly today, so you know, we probably could have gotten away with it, but the idea is a lot of the times we have like costume parties in like December when it's definitely hot, and so this was sort of meant to be that you can layer it but it still stays pretty cool option. That is it for this final Halloween project. Thank you so much for joining me for 13 Projects of Halloween. I've loved going on this adventure with you and seeing all of your comments and excitement over the things that also give me joy. If you haven't already, click subscribe if you would like to continue on this crafty adventure, and I will see you next week for more creative fun. Bye!